Okay, so while I'm waiting for some of these to dry, I've already gone ahead and applied the doors to them. I'm going ahead and putting on some of the other stuff. Since the door on this one is in the center of this side, I do have this side that I can do the lumbering on. But while I'm waiting for all that to dry, it's time to get on to some of the busy work. Shingles. And I know that a lot of people go nuts with shingles, and they can be the most maddening part about building any of these houses. So we're going to do this the easy way. Took this paper cutter, cost me about $12 at Hobby Lobby. Actually, it cost me less than that because I took in the 40% coupon, so it was more like $7. But $7 at Hobby Lobby came with a replacement blade when this one wears out. Watch out. I was thinking when I got this that this white thing was a safety cap and had to be removed. Turns out it's not. It's spring loaded. So I did jab myself in the finger with it. So watch out when you get these, because when I bought this, they were actually both in the track, and you're supposed to pull one out. But watch that if you get one. Okay, so first thing I did was cut a whole bunch of strips of cereal box. It doesn't matter what size you do, because the variety that you put onto it is going to be whatever you want. I'm actually going to use a few different sizes based on just adding a little bit more variety to it, because I want this to be like enough to fill a little small village, so I don't want them to all be identical. But the first thing I did was cut this. Now I did not grid this off. All I did was take a pair of scissors, in this case the EMT shears I have, and just cut it at lengths that I thought looked good. Now as you'll notice, this kind of spirals when you do that. And this is actually a good thing. So I went ahead and cut my little tiles, and we're going to go through and I cut them about 2/3 of the way up. So instead of cutting them off into individual tiles, I cut them so that they're about, let me zoom in on it. There we go. As you can see, the spiraling, it all goes in one direction. Okay, so I cut them about 2/3 of the way up. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut them off in lengths of 4 tiles. Now, the reason the spiraling is a good thing is because what we're going to do is we're going to take, you see the first one is down, slightly above, slightly above, slightly above. We're going to take the down, leave it, above, leave it, take the third one and push it down. Now what this is going to do is when we glue these in place, and we're going to glue them in sets of 4, and you may come out with an odd strand here that has like 1 or 2 on it at the very end after you cut them all down. We're going to glue these on in sets of 4, and when we glue them on like this, you can see that there's a nice raised surface. So when we do the dry brushing at the end, that's going to give us a nice surface to give us a good texture, and it's going to look really good. But that's one of the good things about the spiraling. As far as the size that I trimmed these to on the paper cutter, let me widen back out a bit. I didn't actually measure out what they are. Looks like it's, what is that, 3/8 of an inch? About. Basically all I did was, when I was choosing the size, there's a little lip here on the paper cutter. So I simply pushed the cardboard in until it hit that lip. Let me see if I can get it back in there. Until it hit that lip. Went ahead and pressed down. And that was the size my tile came out. You can measure them if you want to, grid them off, make them specific sizes. I'm not terribly worried about it. This is going to come out really looking nice. But this is the easy way to do the shingles on the roof. Do not do them as individual shingles. Yes, it can make it look more varied and more amateurish as far as the way things were constructed at that point in time. But I've got 12 cottages here. If I'm putting shingles on every single one of them, that's just going to drive you nuts. So here we go, putting them on in sets of 4. and it'll actually go pretty fast. While I'm waiting for some of these to dry in between stages of doing the trim, I'm going to go ahead and go in the other room, watch some YouTube, and cut shingles. Catch you guys in just a couple. Okay, and we're back ready for the second part of the, or the next part of the decorating. I'm going ahead and so far I have put on the decorative timbers and stuff on all the houses that I want to put these onto. Now, one of the things I'm going to do is break up the wood contouring by using some of these little craft sticks. You can buy them in big bags. They're essentially a matchstick with no match head on them. I think they only cost like $2 or $3 at the hobby stores. But there is an issue with them in that if you're doing this, you need to be careful which ones you're using. Don't just grab out a handful, because as you can see, this one is incredibly bowed. Another issue that there is I'm using the chopper to do the details on these because there are so many different sizes that I need. Since I don't want all the houses to look identical. Now I'm going to see if I can zoom in. I've got it against a 90-degree angle here. See if I can get that there. I'm going to zoom in. Okay, now they're both against the same flat edge on this side. They're both against the line here. What you can see is they're not the same length. So because of this, when I'm cutting these, I need to make sure that the side that I'm keeping, if I'm using the cutting guide, that the side that I'm keeping is up against the cutting guide. Because if I was just trying to measure, like on these ones, the cutoff piece that's going to be scrap is going to be smaller than the keeping piece. If I'm just trying to measure, like say I needed a longer piece that I'm cutting for the trim. If I adjust this cutting guide out, it can be a little hard to use if you get it out too far to the side. So sometimes you may want to sit there and say, well, okay, I'm just going to measure the piece that I'm going to keep as scrap, or that I'm going to cut off as scrap, measure that piece, and just put the cutting guide against it. Well, if you're doing something like this where the factory is not producing exactly identical lengths of wood, that can throw off all your measurements. Kind of like it did with the with these pieces where I discovered that they weren't all the same thickness. And looking at them, I pulled some more out of a bag, and they weren't all exactly identical lengths. So that some of them were off by a millimeter or two, which can really add up. And on some of the pieces it did. But it's something that I can easily cover up at the end with some decorative stuff. But when you're using something like the cutter, you want to keep that in mind. Also, the cutter is essentially a razor blade here. It's like a miniature version of the paper cutters that we used in school as kids. Because the blade is simply pushing down and not going at an angle in like you would with an X-Acto knife, because you're usually not going to just push an X-Acto knife down. You're going to be either pulling it against the item you're cutting or pushing it in. You get a cleaner cut. On this, especially, the longer you use it, the more that this trough opens up. That the blade actually, when I first got this, the mat was solid. As you use it, it cuts into the cutting board. And the more I've used it, the wider that trough has gotten. In part because since it's not just going at an angle and it doesn't have any kind of power source on it, you're crushing the wood or whatever you're trying to cut, and in some cases the item may be solid enough that you're trying to cut that it actually pushes the blade out. And that's one thing that you'll notice when you cut with it. Is that I don't think I'll be able to show it on camera. Let's try it anyway. See if you can kind of see it there, that the this end here isn't exactly straight. It's cut at sort of an angle because this is just pushing in, and when it's pushing in, it just kind of edges it out. So the cuts are not going to be exactly straight, so you'll need to take that into account when you're doing it. Also, even with a clean razor blade, or with a fresh razor blade in there, the cuts on these tend to get sloppier as time goes by if you use it a lot, because since that trough cuts into the mat, it's not giving you a solid foundation, so essentially it's pushing wood into there, and every once in a while I have to go through and clean it out with a pick or something to get all the stuff that's collecting in there out of the way, so that it helps keep the razor blade able to cut into it. It's a nice little tool to have. I know that a lot of people have talked about, oh, when I want to mass produce something, I use my chopper. Well, it's good for mass producing things to a certain degree. I had one of these before I got my tabletop bandsaw. This was great and everything for some jobs, but the tabletop bandsaw just blows this thing away as far as mass producing and cutting a lot of things. So even on projects smaller than this, I'd rather just take it over to the bandsaw, spend 2 seconds zipping stuff through, than have to sit here all night using this thing, gauging whether or not the cuts are clean enough, making sure that everything is exactly lined up. So this has some uses, but it's not something that I'm going to use for a lot of stuff. I'm using it for this because I need so many different cuts to fit, so that I can get the parts exactly the size that I need them. And because I'm having to change the measurements so many times. So rather than write it down on pencil on this, take it over to the bandsaw, and then zip it out on the bandsaw 2 pieces at a time, I'm just going to use the cutter. It's going to take me a little while longer, but it'll be a little bit easier. I'm going to go ahead and get these all done up, and I'll catch up on the next step. Okay, so using a similar method to the way that I did the doors, I've gone ahead and glued some of these real small craft sticks onto this piece of cardstock. I set the chopper to the width that I want the windows to be, and I'm going ahead and just cranking out the windows. The craft sticks and the cardstock on this are thin enough that the chopper can do it, although it still does kind of go rough on the edges. The reason I'm doing this is because this way I can just glue these windows into the area that I want. I'm not doing the timbered look on these windows. So I will cut the frame out that I have here, and then once I've done that, I'll go ahead and set the chopper up to do a craft stick the width here. Just glue them in place, and as soon as the craft sticks and everything are dry, I can go ahead and put the windows on. I'll see you at the next step. Okay, while we're waiting for the windows to dry up a bit, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next step. We're going to start working on the roof. Now, I already did I already went ahead and cut a bunch of shingles and everything to get that set up, but we're going to go ahead and actually work on the roof of the building that the shingles are going to go on. Now, when I've dealt with terrain in the past, there have always been, as far as like buildings, there have always been 2 real weak points as far as like small cottages and that kind of thing. First is the base, second is the roof. And I've seen a lot of people that do the shingles just gluing them onto a piece of thin cardstock and on really thin shingles, so the roof kind of gets jagged and everything, because when people are picking them up, they're usually picking them up by the roof. So we're going to go ahead and cut the roof out of a thicker material. I'm using Artist's Illustration board. I got this sheet at Hobby Lobby for $4.60. It's 16 by 20 inches. It's a fairly heavy-duty cardstock. You could cut it with an X-Acto knife, but I've dealt with this stuff before. Cutting it with an X-Acto knife is really a pain in the butt. So what I've done is I've set up the triangle here to 2 1/4 inches, because that's going to be the width of the roof. Let's go ahead and cut some shingle, or cut some roof tiles. see I've got a little bit of jaggedness on this side, but that's not going to be an issue. I'll clean it up easily. Gave me a real nice, smooth, clean cut on this side, and cuts super easy. I'll go ahead and get these cut up, and I'll show you the next step. Okay, so just like that, I have all these roof sections, which are ready to just glue onto here as soon as I get to that stage in the production. But it took all of about maybe 2 minutes to cut the whole stack. I did not do all 12 sets because I'm going to do a couple of these with timbered roofs, which are going to be using these popsicle sticks instead, or wood pile popsicle stick family. But I'll be using these instead on a couple of them. I'll let you guys go for a moment, catch up with you on the next step. Okay, so I'm trying something new on these houses. In the past, when I've done these, I like to have a stucco appearance on them. So I go ahead and add texture paint, which, for those of you that don't know, texture paint is essentially just latex paint with sand added to it. But when I did the cottages before for a different project, doing this timbered appearance with all these little beams and stuff was kind of hard because of the texture paint getting on them, and it kind of made it messy. So what I'm trying in this project is to go ahead and, instead of applying texture paint after I've already primed them and am in the final processes, what I'm doing is going ahead and adding sand right now while the roofs and everything are still off. I'm going ahead and adding the paint, or the glue in here. I'm using black scenic sand, and I'm just sprinkling some over it to give it a sand appearance. This should, as long as I don't over prime them, this should make it fairly easy to get the stucco appearance without having to worry about getting the texture paint all over the wooden trim and everything. Because it's a lot easier to control this right now with the roof off and the base and everything off, when I can just flip them around on their sides, than it is to do this once they're all completely constructed. This is scenic sand. It's what's used for doing sand paintings. It's available at most hobby stores here in the United States. I don't know about overseas because I don't know how popular sand paintings are overseas. You can see that I'm not going for complete coverage. I'm just going for sprinkling it on to get enough of a texture to give it that nice stucco appearance once it's all painted up. Like I said, I haven't tried this particular style or method before, because most of the projects that I apply textured paint to don't have this trim, so it's not as much of a pain in the butt. And the last time that I did the cottages and I used this trim, it was a major pain in the butt because I had to keep wiping the texture paint off of it. So far I'm pretty happy with this. It's not taking that much time to do. And we'll see once it's all done just how well this worked out. And there we have it. Well, I'll see you in a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and let these dry, and I'll be back when we get to the next. Okay, so I got all of my roofs attached, and windows put on and everything stuccoed. When I did the roofs, sorry, when I did the roofs for these wooden ones, I wasn't quite happy with how much these were attaching to each other, because they're not fully sitting flat on each of the on the roof angle and on each other. So what I did was I went ahead and went inside and reinforced it with hot glue, and that should pretty much keep it in place, even with any rough handling or anything between the glue and between the hot glue inside and the regular glue outside, gluing them to each other. They should stay pretty well put. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is work on the base. Now, one of the things that this project was for was to show how easily a bandsaw could help you out with even simple materials like poster board or the wooden craft sticks and stuff. But I want to put them onto a good solid base. So a nice, cheap, easy way to go get basing material, if you don't want to go to the hardware store and work with a bigger sheet of wood, I went ahead and I went to the Dollar Tree, which, for those of you that don't know, Dollar Tree is a store where everything inside is $1 or less. And I bought a bunch of these clipboards. They're really hard chipboard. They'll produce a nice base, and they're fairly thin. They were $1 a piece. All you have to do is pop out these 2 rivets. I took a screwdriver and a hammer and gently tapped each of those out. And then you're left with this, because for some reason they plastic wrapped it underneath the clip. But you end up with a sheet that you can actually cut on the bandsaw, and here's one unwrapped. But it's going to be nice and solid. And the reason I don't want to do this on these is because, in addition to the roof, the base is going to be the next most fragile part of this. A lot of people will put these onto cardboard bases or heavy cardstock bases, and even if you use the drywall compound to fill in gaps and try and make it look nicer and reinforce it, that's fairly brittle. And think about it, when you're picking up the houses and putting them down, most people don't carefully put them down on the table, they just kind of put them down. And because of the base having the edges on it, those are going to take the most wear and tear. Also, the base provides a little bit of extra protection for these, because anyone moving any tanks or anything through, if you're playing a sci-fi game, or large monsters if you're playing like a D&D game, the base is usually going to act as a buffer for most of those figures. So instead of letting them hit the actual cottage when they're moving them around, a lot of them will just move them on the table, and the base will act as a little bit of an extra buffer to help keep this from getting too much damage to it. So by taking these precautions, using this heavy artist's board, as the foundation for my roof, and using these as the basing material, these should come out fairly sturdy. Well, actually, I know they'll come out fairly sturdy because I've used this kind of material for other stuff. So this should come out as a pretty good finished product. I'm going to go ahead and get the bandsaw set up to cut up some of these as bases for the houses, and we'll be right back for the next step.